Welcome to this episode of Sunny Silver Linings. Sunny's guest today is Jamison West, strategic coach at ConnectStrat. Jamison and Sunny chat about his brand new book that was recently published called The Emotional Side of Selling Your Small Business. They chat about why this topic is so important to Jamison, including how to adequately prepare for selling and the transition that requires you to ask yourself, what's next? After listening, you can purchase the book now on Amazon or at jamisonwest.com. And now, your host, the founder and CEO of IT by Design, Mr. Sunny Kala. Over to you, Sunny.
Jamison, thank you so much for joining me as my guest today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and it was great seeing you at IT Nation. And as always, wherever you were, there was that, a lot of your MSP friends, and you had that tribe with you. And it was, it's like, when we work in a community and you see that when we come together, especially after 2 years in person, and how exciting it is to see each other.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. It was fun to have all three of the companies I'm kind of deeply associated with well represented. And then just, I think it was my 12th or 13th IT Nation, and I've been a speaker at many of them. So it was just neat to connect with everybody. It felt, I had multiple conversations where folks said that felt like COVID wasn't happening at that conference, right? Like it was very connecting, and it's great to be at.
Yeah, just like build it. Energy was there, vibe was there.
Absolutely.
It was like, we are back.
Yeah, no, Build It was the first one that felt that way to me. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Very good.
So first of all, congratulations on your book, and amazing title. And I think there's so much happening on that topic in the channel in terms of M&A activities. And I think it's really great to see you publishing this book. And my first question, let's start with why. Why this book? Why this topic? And why now?
Yeah, so great questions. So why this book and why this topic? I realized, so I did 4 acquisitions before I decided to sell. I could have written a book or 2 on the acquisitions and being a buyer and kind of the frustrations of, but what I realized is as I was going through the journey, a little bit of acquiring, but absolutely the journey of selling, there was a lot of literature, there were plenty of books, there were resources around financial metrics, banking, valuations, all these M&A advisors. So there was stuff all over the place to kind of help me out, get an understanding of how a transaction would work, but nothing really prepared me for the emotional turmoil, the journey, the ups and downs. It was very challenging for me. And not everybody I've talked to had struggled in the way I did, but there are many people who have. What I realized, I started asking questions after I completed the sale, and I started asking questions of others who'd been through the same, and my journey was not unique. And they all struggled through it on their own without conversations and without resources. And that's when the idea struck me. And then frankly, Arlen Sorensen, who's really kind of been focused on M&A for ConnectWise and the IT Nation community, had me on a panel where I was talking about this. And I was like, why not me? I felt like I could share and give back a little bit. I procrastinated. This is my first book. I procrastinated. But I put it out there that I was going to get it done. So the why now, I was featured as a case study in a friend's book, and the person who helped edit that case study and worked with me on it, I was extremely impressed by. When words hit paper and I consumed what we put together and we did that together, it felt great. And I said, I think I might have found the person to help me with just to make sure that this is tight and well done. And so at the end of that experience, I called him up and said, hey, I've got a project. And he was willing to jump in on that with me. And 9 months later, we have a great book.
Yeah, the emotional side of selling is small business. Great title. And yeah, so I totally agree with you in terms of what information is available on this topic. And there's just so much math and science behind the transaction type of information that, how the multiple works and the strategic play versus overall, everything that you need to know as a buyer or seller. And especially when you're on the selling side, that what's next type of questions that come up with a lot of entrepreneurs after selling their small business, especially when they're not ready to retire yet. They're young, they want to stay useful. And that's when, you probably struggle with that answer or that question in terms of what's next and that emotional side. So let's talk about that a little bit more. If you now reflect on that question, when you were going through that emotional journey after selling, can you talk to me a little bit more about where your head was and what was going through your mind when you were going through that emotional side?
Yeah, it's, and I think there's, I've had this conversation a lot frequently where I think there might be fodder for a second book here. I get kind of excited thinking about it, and it's a little daunting because it was a lot of work. But the majority of the journey I talk about in this book is really that moment of realization where, wow, I could sell this for something, all the way through the transaction, and less about the next half, which is like the now what question, the emotional journey after. So this book really addresses up to the transaction, and all of the struggles of what it looked like to get your business sold, like that part of the journey. I've been talking with many entrepreneurs who've said, that now what, and people have different answers. Some people find their purpose not in working, but in exploring and retiring if they have the resources and the means to do so. Others are, even if they have the resources and means, are just feel like they have to continue contributing in some way in the profession they were involved in. And then others, frankly, think they can sell for something that's going to put them in a place where they don't need to worry about finances for the rest of their life. It's just not true for most people who are selling their small business. It may not be the number they need. So there are a lot of challenges there for me, and it was a part of this whole thing is you kind of birth something, a business that you pour maybe 20 or 30 years into, and it becomes a significant part of your identity, and then you have to not just let it go, but sell your part of your identity for money, and it's this bizarre trade-off that like you have to reconcile those things in your head, and that has definitely been an interesting conversation with a lot of folks.
Yeah, so especially for the founders, a small business is just like a child, right?
Yeah,
I know I founded IT by Design in 2003, and like when I look at IT by Design, it's like, okay, I have 3 boys and this is my 4th boy. And, and if there are dog owners out there, then they're like, just like a dog, right? You just there is that attachment, that emotional connection, and it's just like your child, right? It's just like your child. And especially when you are in that business for 23 years, 20 to 30 years, and you're just looking at this child that is 20 or 30-year-old, and you're like, I don't want to sell for money. And it can be very difficult. Now, talk to me a little bit more there, Jamison, so some kind of overall emotions that you have gone through when you were in that transactional kind of stage, where I know it takes time, right? So starting with when the first call to by the time that everything is said and done, it takes time, and that can be very tough for an entrepreneur, for a small business owner who is selling.
Yeah, there were many components, and I go through a lot of things in the book, but I think and every time I'm asked that question, what pops into my head is it can be a little different. But the thing that predominantly jumps at me as an example, and what really struck me is I tend to be an extremely transparent, open person. But once you start walking down this path, there's a high level of confidentiality and non-disclosure. You can't tell your entire team that you're thinking about selling, but it might not happen. Once you reach that point of signing a letter of intent and getting into due diligence and all of that craziness, you stop making decisions that are going to cost money that you're not going to recover in the business. And when you're a person who moves fast, like I was, and all of a sudden everything stops, my door went from being open all the time to being closed a lot of the time for private conversations. I had to ask people in my organization to find things or prepare things that I wouldn't ordinarily ask them to do, and I wouldn't tell them why because I couldn't. So from an integrity perspective, that was extremely challenging. I mean, I cared for these people. Some of them were my close friends, and it felt like, you know, there wasn't an intention to lie, but I was withholding truth, and that's not a habit of mine. And that was and then the problem is eventually I had to make a decision, and I made what many would arguably say was a poor decision to begin informing key members and eventually everybody on my staff knew before the transaction was complete. That's a dangerous place to be, because at that point, now I'm completely committed, not only emotionally, which I was already emotionally committed, but now I've like put my entire business at risk, where if the transaction doesn't go through, I've now exposed my willingness to sell in a way that could be a tremendous backlash if the transaction doesn't occur. So it kind of puts me as the seller in a significant disadvantage when we sit at the table and talk about the fine minutia of the deal. So that became it was just back and forth. It was a roller coaster.
Yeah, and yeah, so I can't imagine, cannot imagine the emotional side of the team as well. So you're leading yourself in terms of your own emotions, and now you have a team that is more like family to you, and now you have to have this kind of crucial conversation with them. And also, so talk to me a little bit about their emotional side as well. So how was it when you had that first conversation with your key people?
Well, it depended on the individual. I had people who understood the metrics or maybe had a touch of equity or something that were kind of excited by the conversation. I had people who felt like their job was at risk and there was extraordinary fear. I had some people who were kind of indifferent, you know, it's a job. But those who were really relying on it just, the trick is, you know, I have 25 people at the time or whatever it was. And like anything, you try to help from a cultural perspective, bring them all in one direction. But their individual circumstances and longevity with the company and all of those components really triggered different reactions and responses across the board, which became hard to manage. And I was so overwhelmed or in an emotional state where I was maybe less prepared than usual to deal with each of those unique situations. I lost a couple people, really key critical people right around the transaction time. And that was my fault. But what was a relief for me was the burden of secrecy was no longer on my shoulders. And there were a lot of other components. I mean, this is just a thread of one of those examples, but there was a lot. And what was really helpful is the book is a fable. It's not my story of my sale, but you'll see some pieces of what I went through in there, certainly. I also pulled upon the experiences of several other people I know who've been through similar circumstances, but not the same. Their own experiences, their own emotions, their own critical moments in the transaction and did a case study, 6 different case studies that are all after the fable in the book. So you can kind of see how we drew from different people who had these experiences and ways to mitigate them, advice, thinking was very, very helpful.
Yeah. And so, okay, so question, there are a lot of MSPs that are watching this video, and there's a lot going on in the channel, and there's a lot of activity, right? We have seen that at IT Nation as well. So what's your advice to people where they are about to start this journey? Any recommendations, any suggestions for them so that they can manage their emotional side better?
Yeah, so 2 succinct things jump to mind, and one is read the book. Like there's a lot in there, and to have a resource like this to prepare me for what might happen would have been huge. So I know it's a self-serving comment, but I really do mean that. There's not a lot of resources out there. I've done some searching. There's an HBR article that kind of touches on it. I haven't found a book or anything that really helps with this. Second, and this is part of a case study in the book, is Arlen Sorensen was one of these 6 case studies. And I think that his example most succinctly helps answer this question, which is be extraordinarily clear on what your list of non-negotiables are for any given massive decision or transaction, especially when there's a negotiation involved. If you know what your non-negotiables are, then you won't emotionally commit and let a prospective buyer chip away at your non-negotiables until you've found yourself in a position that's vastly less than what you'd expected or hoped for when this all started. And that was incredible advice.
That's awesome. And yeah, so from IT Nation, you mentioned Arlen, and he did talk about modes or mindsets, the 4 mindsets. Yep. So what I want to talk about is that if you see any difference in terms of a small business owner being in a startup mode versus empire building mode, and how that relates to the emotional side, because they are totally in a different journey as entrepreneurs. Do you see any difference in terms of an empire builder selling versus a startup or other modes selling, the balance builders to other ones that are the 4 modes?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I haven't really examined that before. My thinking is, what I see happen is when folks get into and we see this at ConnectStrat with our clients all the time, right? When folks get into the point where they've made a determination that they want to exit, they know the value that they want, and they've spent a few years building a valuable, sellable company with that in mind, and they've taken years to think about that a lot of these emotions tend to temper down quite a bit, and they're more prepared for that. So you kind of get into that more operationally mature or intentional mindset, and it tampers down those emotions. Where people get more caught is where they've spent 25 years building a lifestyle business. They haven't emotionally got to that point. They haven't operationally matured. And they're like, wait a minute, security is the new critical thing I need to work, or whatever business. This, it's kind of about an MSP, but this applies anywhere. All of a sudden there's a shift in the strategy that's required, or things are technically more complicated. And the owner's like, I've been doing this for 25 years. It's a lifestyle business, but it's, it's running. I'm making some profit. I've been living on this, and now I'm going to sell it, and it's not worth what they thought it was worth. Yeah. And they don't want to spend 5 more years making that happen. And there's some difficult decision making to be done, right? And those folks who've not spent years thinking and planning for that intentional outcome get far more caught into this trap. And even though I built the business for 21 years with some of this in mind, my intent to sell, my thinking that I may do it to the point of sale was very, very quick. Mostly because I'd had a tumultuous set of acquisitions. that kind of exhausted me, and I decided I needed a change in my career. But so that came very, very quickly, which certainly attributed to a more difficult journey.
Yeah. So James, in my general sense there, when I'm thinking about the different mindsets or the modes versus the emotional mapping with those modes, and a couple of things that I'm thinking about is one, if I'm an empire builder, right, then empire, so maybe I have built the business to a point where, like we have a lot of empire builders where they have taken PE money. They took some of their risk, early on when they took that PE money. There's a percentage that's already gone, right? Or they have money in the bank. And now it's a totally different journey as a small business owner when you are in that mode. And then if you are just kind of burning your own money and you are in other modes, then you have everything on the table. You haven't taken anything off of that table. And
That's
your
right.
emotions are a lot more connected there at a deeper level. Now,
Yeah.
So the everything is around fear, uncertainty, and doubt when you go through that journey. So your fears, your uncertainty, your doubt is going to be different, because if you are an entrepreneur or a small business owner who is selling, and you haven't made enough progress that by making that transaction happen, now you have enough money that gives you options, right? You don't probably need to work for money because you have enough money. Then it's a totally different mindset in terms of that journey, versus when you are not going to have enough money and you still have to work. Then, for example, I hear this a lot. After this transaction, I'm not going to make enough money, so I do need to continue to work. Now, the company that is acquiring nowadays, a lot of PE companies, and that business, that small business owner now need to report to someone, and that's a very emotional. That's very emotional for that owner who has been reporting to no one for like 20, 30 years, right? So what are your thoughts there in terms of people that are PE back now dealing with this emotional side when they are about to have that transaction, versus people that are all in, they don't have anything off of the table yet?
So to me, I mean, I think what would naturally occur when I think about like that bootstrapped individual, no outside money, entirely on their own, money is a massive factor. And there's all these other components that are, it's just an element. So you move into that kind of PE space where money is not a factor, maybe as much individually or even for the organization from an expense, or like you're taking one of those 4, 5, 6 components and saying, I no longer have to worry about this one. And so it dramatically lowers the emotions. That said, I think about the example I gave you about at the beginning about my largest struggles, and I didn't talk about money. And that still exists in the second scenario. Now, if I'm that said, I can prepare to mitigate that emotional journey and that problem by creating a culture of people who know that we're building for a second exit. There's a profit sharing structure in place. Everybody's aligned to an outcome that means a probable exit or sale. And now all of a sudden, all of those issues, and I have a client who's done an extraordinary job of this. Their rather large team is pretty clear that they're on this journey of acquisitions and sale, and everybody feels like they're a part of that story. And now all of a sudden, that challenge that I had with feeling like I was lacking some sense of integrity no longer exists because there's transparency. And that has nothing to do with the money side, right? So all of a sudden he doesn't have the money problem or the integrity problem. And with the right kind of preparation, I think you can begin to mitigate these things before a transaction happens.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And if people want to buy this book, where can they buy the book, and other resources that you recommend people where they are thinking of going through M&A?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's on Amazon. I self-published. And if you go to jamisonwest.com, JAMISONWEST.com, I have an easy link to it. So you have to go there and search around. That probably makes it easiest. So that's what I'd recommend. There is Harvard Business Review. If you do some searching out there, there are 1 or 2 articles on HBR that begin to talk about this, especially you'd mentioned kind of that pre-sale and post-sale. There's actually a couple of incredibly good articles about that entrepreneurial mindset post-sale going, what have I done? Because not only selling your baby, but maybe part of your purpose, like your purpose was wound up in this. And all of a sudden you're looking into the ether and you have this lack of certainty that's difficult. So maybe a second book in there. We'll see.
Thank you for sharing that, Jamison. And we always appreciate your partnership, collaboration, and thank you for coming to my podcast.
Thank you, Sunny. I appreciate it.